Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On a cold winter day in 1942, David Davidson stepped into one of New York's most prestigious hotels, and no one could have guessed that he would end up staying there for a lifetime. He wore a long coat, a fedora hat on his head, and carried a brown suitcase in his hand. Walking silently, he made his way to the reception desk. The lobby was bustling with elegantly dressed people engaged in conversation. Waiters carefully, carrying trays filled with plates and grand crystal chandeliers sparkling brightly. Davidson did not let his eyes wander too much and approached the receptionist directly. "I'd like a room," he said in a calm and confident voice. The receptionist glanced at the registry book before asking, "Single or double, sir?" Davidson thought for a few seconds and then smiled slightly. "Single," he replied. "I plan to stay for a long time." It was clear that the hotel was accustomed to such guests. During those years, many people opted for long-term hotel stays, especially due to the uncertainty brought by the war. However, Davidson's stay would last far longer than anyone could have anticipated. When Davidson settled into room 304, the hotel staff regarded him as just another guest. The room was elegantly furnished, featuring high ceilings, large windows that allowed the city lights to pour in, a bed, a desk, a velvet armchair, and a small bookshelf. From the wide window, one could watch the bustling streets of New York. Davidson opened his suitcase and neatly arranged his belongings. Inside, there were a few sets of clothes, an old typewriter, a notebook, and a dozen books. In the early days, he would have breakfast in the hotel restaurant in the mornings, then retreat to his room in the afternoons to read books or type on his typewriter. The housekeeping staff noticed that he was an exceptionally tidy guest. His room was always neat and his belongings were never out of place. As time passed, the hotel staff began to notice something unusual about Davidson. He never left the hotel. A week passed, then a month, then 3 months. Davidson had not stepped outside even once. At first, no one paid much attention to this, as many guests sometimes secluded themselves in their rooms to focus on their private matters. But there was something different about Davidson's case. Every morning, he ordered breakfast from the hotel restaurant, and for lunch and dinner, he had his meals delivered via room service. He spent the entire day in his room, only coming down to the lobby in the evenings to sit by the fireplace and read his newspaper. The hotel staff began talking about him. "He never goes outside," said Mary, one of the housekeeping staff, to the kitchen workers. "Maybe he's sick or hiding from someone," replied the bartender. "No, he looks perfectly healthy. It's just, I don't know, it's like he's disconnected from the world." As the days went by, Davidson started engaging in conversations with people in the lobby. Some of the hotel's regular patrons described him as a quiet yet polite man with extensive knowledge of intellectual subjects. Politics, history, literature. He could discuss anything, but he rarely spoke about himself. "Mr. Davidson, are you here for business?" an elderly businessman asked one evening. Davidson smiled slightly and nodded. "I'm occupied with my own affairs," he simply replied. As time passed, both the staff and the guests grew accustomed to Davidson's mysterious presence. Rumors began circulating about him. Some believed he was a wealthy writer, while others thought he was a man running from his past. But no one knew the real truth, and so months turned into years. Davidson had become a part of the hotel itself. As he continued to stay at the hotel, the staff paid even more attention to his presence. Initially, no one questioned it too much since he was just a long-term guest. However, as months went by without him stepping outside, not even for shopping or taking a walk, and rarely even coming down to the lobby, he became an enigmatic figure. His daily habits were rigid and unchanging. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., he would order his breakfast from room service. He typically asked for a cup of coffee, a boiled egg, and toast. The hotel kitchen staff noticed that his orders never changed. His lunch and dinner were also set in a routine. For lunch and dinner, Davidson's meals followed a consistent pattern: soup, a light main course, and always a slice of dessert. With every order, he would write short and polite notes, never engaging in lengthy conversations. The housekeeping staff noticed something remarkable each time they entered Davidson's room. It was always impeccably tidy. His bed was always made, his desk was neat, and his belongings seemed to be placed as if by the millimeter. But over time, they began to notice small but noticeable changes in the room. In the beginning, Davidson's room only had a few books, but as time passed, the bookshelves started to fill up. Initially, the small shelf in the room was enough, but within a year, the books had increased so much that he had to ask the hotel staff for an extra shelf. Then came a new desk. Later, more shelves. Notes spilling over from the books began to cover the walls. Small pieces of paper with sentences, quotes, some with Latin or French words. One day, while dusting, housekeeping staff member Mary read one of the notes. Time flows outside, inside it freezes. This sentence made her feel uneasy. It seemed as though Davidson had created a world of his own inside the room. Some staff members had dared to ask him questions while cleaning, but Davidson always gave polite yet brief answers. "Mr. Davidson, would you like something special?" "Thank you, just a little quiet." Davidson's mysterious lifestyle became one of the most talked about subjects in the hotel's kitchen and staff rooms. "Did you notice he never goes outside?" said bartender George one day while talking to his colleague. "Yeah, he never goes shopping or for a walk," confirmed waitress Alice. "Maybe he's running away from something," said one person. "Who knows, maybe he's a former criminal, or someone who made a fortune and is hiding from the world." After a while, some of the hotel's regular guests began to talk about him too. Some thought he was a former academic, while others believed he was a retired executive from a big company who had withdrawn into seclusion. But Davidson never spoke about his past. Another strange detail was that Davidson almost never received visitors. In the first few years after his arrival, he occasionally received letters. But over time, the letters dwindled and eventually stopped coming altogether. One day, one of the hotel staff brought an envelope to Davidson's room. Davidson took the letter, studied the paper for a moment, and after thanking the staff member, closed the door. Later, he was seen throwing the envelope into the small trash can by the fireplace without ever opening it. From that day onward, no more letters arrived for him. As the years passed, it became noticeable that Davidson was aging. His hair turned white, his movements slowed, but his habits remained unchanged. He still ordered books regularly, used room service, and received his weekly newspapers. One day, one of the waiters who brought his meals gathered the courage to ask him, "Mr. Davidson, excuse me, but you never go outside. Is there a reason for that?" Davidson looked up at the waiter and smiled faintly. "Outside is a necessity for those who forget how to be inside," he said calmly. The waiter couldn't make sense of this answer, but he didn't press further. It was clear that Davidson had created his own world, and he had no intention of leaving it. He had become not just a guest at the hotel, but a part of it. Since David Davidson entered the hotel in 1942, he continued to stay in the same room for years. Initially, the hotel management didn't pay much attention to his long-term stay, thinking he was just another long-term guest. But as 5, 10, and even 20 years passed, Davidson was still there. And the most fascinating thing was he still had never stepped outside the hotel. Hotel staff came and went, management changed, but Davidson's routine never wavered. Every morning, he ordered breakfast, spent his days reading books in his room, or writing on his typewriter. Although he rarely appeared in the lobby, all the staff knew him. With his polite but distant demeanor, he had truly become a part of the hotel. Davidson's continuous stay at the hotel initially caught the attention of the management. Hotels typically don't prefer long-term stays because hotel rooms become more profitable with constantly changing guests. However, Davidson was different. He caused no problems, paid his bills on time, and constantly took advantage of the hotel's services. In the mid-1950s, the hotel's finance manager decided to hold a meeting regarding Davidson's extended stay. "This man has been here for 15 years, he said to the accountant. "Yes, Mr. Davidson. He's probably the longest staying guest in the hotel." Do you know he never leaves? The accountant nodded. Yes, but he's never complained, he pays his bills on time, and he hasn't had any issues with anyone. He's not a bad guest for the hotel. This situation caught the management's attention. A customer like Davidson was actually a huge advantage for the hotel. A permanent guest meant a constantly occupied room. Moreover, making Davidson's stay permanent was thought to be financially beneficial for the hotel. In 1958, the hotel's new management reached out to Davidson to make a special arrangement with him. The hotel's general manager sent Davidson a note one evening. Mr. Davidson, we would like to have a conversation with you about our long-term accommodation policies. Please contact us at your convenience. Davidson carefully read the letter. He had been staying here for years, but the hotel management had never wanted to have a formal discussion with him before. At first, he considered ignoring the invitation, but the next day he decided to meet with the hotel manager, something he rarely did. A special room in the hotel was prepared for the meeting. When Davidson entered slowly, the manager approached him with a friendly smile. Mr. Davidson, you've been a valued guest at our hotel for many years, and we see that you don't seem to be planning on leaving. Davidson nodded in agreement. We'd like to offer you a special deal. Since your stay here is indefinite, we'd like to create a rental plan that suits you. While our regular hotel prices fluctuate, we can set a fixed rate for you. This way you'll be comfortable and will also have a steady income. Davidson thought for a moment. Over the years he had spent in the hotel, it had become more than just a place to stay. It had become his home. There was no reason not to accept this offer. Agreed, he said briefly. Thus, Davidson's rent was fixed and a special contract was prepared for him. He was no longer just a guest. He had become a permanent resident of the hotel. After the agreement was made, Davidson's daily routine didn't change. He still never left and continued to make use of everything the hotel offered. His book orders were regularly delivered to his room. Thanks to his weekly newspaper subscriptions, he kept up with developments around the world. He continued to have his meals delivered by room service. He took advantage of the hotel's cleaning services, but never allowed the housekeepers to do much in his room. Over the years, some of the hotel's rules changed, but exceptions were always made for Davidson. For example, when room service prices increased, Davidson's contract ensured that he continued to pay the special rate. Management changed several times, but Davidson's status remained the same. Davidson had become a legend among the hotel staff and regular guests. Employees told new hires about his story. Look, there's this guy, Mr. Davidson in room 304. He's been here since 1942. No way, really? Really? And he still never goes outside. At first, the new employees found it hard to believe, but as they saw that Davidson had always stayed in the same room, they started to accept that he was truly an extraordinary person. Some of the long-term guests at the hotel had also gotten used to him. Occasionally, when they saw him in the hotel restaurant, they would greet him. Davidson would politely respond, but he avoided engaging in long conversations. As the years passed, the hotel's decor changed, and the rooms were renovated, but Davidson's room remained the same. He had become a figure in the hotel's history, like no other. No one truly knew why Davidson never left the hotel. Some thought he was running from something in his past, while others believed he had deliberately cut off his connection to the outside world. But whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. He had become part of the hotel, and so Davidson continued to live in the hotel, a man who defied the flow of time. When David Davidson first stepped into the hotel, the shadow of the war still roamed the streets of New York. In 1942, when he decided to stay at the hotel, no one could have predicted that he would live in that room for 60 years. But as time went on, Davidson's presence became a routine reality for the hotel. Over the decades, his room became more than just a place to stay. It had turned into a living space. What was originally designed as one of the hotel's luxurious rooms had now become a reflection of Davidson's personal world. One of Davidson's greatest passions was reading. Over time, a small bookshelf was no longer enough, and the hotel management provided him with additional shelves. But as the years passed, even the shelves became insufficient. All the walls in his room were covered with books. There were so many books that some were stacked on top of each other. Old encyclopedias, philosophy books, works on science and history were scattered all around the room. Some books were so worn out that their pages had yellowed and their covers had become frayed. But Davidson never thought of throwing them away. Each one was a treasure to him. As time passed, Davidson's room not only became filled with books, but the walls also began to reflect his thoughts. Small notes written on pieces of paper were pinned everywhere. Latin quotes, philosophical musings, and old newspaper clippings decorated the room's walls. Some notes contained long sentences written in handwriting. Time is not a river, it is a prison. A person can discover the world even within four walls. Davidson's room also accumulated old newspapers. Over the years, he had subscribed to newspapers weekly and kept them. He would read and store them. In one corner of the room, there were stacks of newspapers, dating from the 1940s all the way through the 1980s and 90s. This collection was like a time capsule. A large portion of the hotel staff had changed over the years. New managers came, old employees retired, and the hotel's interior decor was renovated several times. But Davidson's room and his habits never changed. Former employees who knew him began to notice that Davidson was aging. The man who used to walk upright now had a slight hunch. His hair had turned completely white, and the lines on his face had deepened. His movements had slowed down a bit, but strangely enough, his daily routine remained the same. Around 7 a.m., he would order his breakfast and spend the majority of his day reading and writing. For the new employees, he had become a true legend. New waiters or housekeepers would hear stories about him and wonder if he was real. "Has he really never left the hotel?" they would ask. "Yes, he's been living here since 1942, one of the old employees would answer. The new employees, sometimes when they went to Davidson's room for service, couldn't believe their eyes. It no longer looked like a hotel room. It resembled an archive of a bookstore or an old library. Over time, the hotel had to adapt to the outside world. In the 1960s, the lobby's design was modernized, and in the 1970s, televisions were added to the rooms. By the 1980s, the hotel management carried out a major renovation, except for the room Davidson stayed in. While new furniture was placed in all the hotel's rooms, Davidson's room was untouched. The management knew he wouldn't want any changes, and Davidson didn't want anything new. He loved his room the way it was, and wanted everything to stay the same. By the 1990s, he had become the hotel's oldest and most mysterious guest. Davidson had almost no visitors over the years. In the early days, a few letters had been sent to him, but these gradually decreased and eventually stopped entirely. One day, a new receptionist in the hotel lobby saw that a package had been sent to Davidson's room. He picked up the package and noticed the date on it, shipping date 1974. The package had been forgotten in a corner of the hotel for nearly 20 years. The receptionist immediately forwarded the package to Davidson. Davidson took the package, looked at it for a while. He didn't know or remember who it was from. Eventually, he carefully opened it, and inside was an old photograph. In the photograph, a young man and a woman were smiling. Davidson stared at the photo for a while, then gently closed it and placed it among his books. After that day, the lights in Davidson's room remained on for several days. Davidson's life seemed to defy time itself. He was a figure that didn't change no matter what happened in the outside world. Weddings, parties, and celebrations were held at the hotel. New guests arrived, and old guests left. But Davidson was always there. Every morning he ordered his breakfast, read his newspaper, and got lost among his books. As the years passed, his presence became as natural as the hotel itself. Perhaps Davidson stayed there to defy the flow of time. As the world outside changed, he tried to stay the same. But sooner or later, time would catch up with everyone. And for Davidson, that was inevitable. David Davidson, who had entered the hotel in 1942, was still living in the same room at the threshold of the new millennium. The outside world was now a completely different place. People had discovered the internet. The digital revolution had begun, and cities were filled with skyscrapers. But in Davidson's room, time passed at a very different pace. Perhaps it didn't pass at all. By the 2000s, nearly the entire hotel had been modernized. The lobby dazzled with its new design, rooms were equipped with the latest technology, and a digital key system had been implemented. However, one room had remained unchanged, room 304. Davidson's presence still appeared in the hotel records, but some of the new managers had started to question whether he was real. Is someone living in room 304? Since 1942? When one of the new managers reviewed the old hotel records and saw that Davidson was still there, he was surprised. Some employees told him that this man was a legend, that he hadn't left the hotel in years. However, the manager didn't believe it and wanted to check the situation himself. One day he decided to knock on his door. When the hotel manager knocked on Davidson's door, a faint, muffled voice came from inside. "Come in." When the manager opened the door, he found an old, shabby room. Everything here was different from the rest of the hotel. The room still maintained the atmosphere of the 1940s. The faded bookshelves on the walls were filled with old books whose pages had yellowed. On the desk was a typewriter from the 1960s, still marked with ink stains. In one corner of the room, piles of newspapers reached nearly to the ceiling. The topmost newspaper was dated 1985. An old, shabby lamp cast its yellow light across the room, creating shadows on the walls. And right next to the bed, the hotel's oldest guest sat. Davidson's face was now filled with deep wrinkles. His eyes remained sharp but weary. His hair had turned completely white and his back had become quite hunched. But he still continued to live with the same habits. The manager gently asked him, "Mr. Davidson, how much longer do you plan to stay here?" Davidson smiled slightly. "Until I die." After receiving this answer, the manager did not press further, because Davidson was not just someone living here. He had become intertwined with the hotel's history. His staying here wasn't a problem. Perhaps he was part of the hotel itself. When new staff first heard about Davidson's existence, they found it hard to believe. Over time, they learned that this man, lost in the past in a corner of the hotel, truly existed. Some of the staff had the opportunity to observe him while serving him meals. In the mornings, he still ordered the same breakfast: a cup of black coffee, a slice of toasted bread, and some cheese. During the day, he usually read books, sometimes typing something on his typewriter. In the evenings, he quietly sat in his room, almost never turning off the lights. Some waiters, curious about Davidson's past, tried to talk to him, but Davidson rarely spoke, usually answering questions politely but with brief responses. "Have you ever considered going outside?" asked one employee, to which Davidson simply replied, "Has anything changed outside?" For him, the world beyond his room made no difference. Everything remained the same. Davidson's room had now become a contrast to the rest of the hotel. The hotel had gone digital. Room service was ordered through a mobile app instead of the phone. But Davidson didn't even have a phone. He still used old-fashioned order forms. Other hotel guests occasionally became aware of him. Some admired his existence, while others found it unsettling. "The man hasn't left for 60 years. "Really?" "Yes, he's still living here. I'd love to see the room." However, no one was ever allowed to enter Davidson's room without permission. He was a man who preferred to stay in his own world. By the time the 2000s arrived, Davidson was no longer just the hotel's oldest guest. He had become a living piece of history. He had witnessed the war years, the hotel's brightest days, economic crises, and the modernization processes. But none of that mattered to him. The only thing that mattered to him was his room, the place where time had stopped. And here, within these four walls, he continued to live out his life. On a cold winter morning in 2002, silence reigned in room 304. Hotel staff had, as usual, prepared Davidson's breakfast and left it outside his door. But this time, the food on the tray remained untouched. This was unusual, because Davidson would always take his breakfast at a specific time and, before closing the door, would nod his head slightly as a gesture of thanks. But today, the door had not been opened. Hours passed. Hotel management began to worry. They decided to knock on the door of the man who had been an unchanging part of the hotel for 60 years. When no answer came, the housekeeping staff used the spare key to open the door, and there, they witnessed the final moments of a man trapped in time. Davidson was sitting in the old chair by his bed. His eyes were slightly open, and his face seemed frozen with a peaceful expression. In his hand he held an old photograph, one that had yellowed over the years, of a woman and a young man whose identities were unknown. Nothing had changed in the room. The books still filled the shelves and the newspapers were stacked in piles. His typewriter was left open on the desk, with the last lines he had written stuck inside the paper roll. Some people discover life by traveling the world, while others live life in a single room. For him, the world took shape not outside, but here, within these four walls. News of Davidson's death quickly spread throughout the hotel. Former staff members gathered, shocked and saddened by the news. Some had always thought he would be here forever. It seemed as though the hotel and Davidson had become inseparable, one and the same. One of the waiters who had served him for years, unable to hold back tears, whispered, "The hotel will never be the same." The hotel management tried to find Davidson's family or any relatives, but none could be found. He had spent his life entirely alone. There would be no funeral or anyone to mourn his loss. But within the hotel, it seemed as though Davidson's spirit had permeated every corner. Days later, the hotel management decided to clear out Davidson's room. After 60 years of housing a man's life, this room would finally be left empty. When the housekeeping staff entered, they paused for a moment. This was no ordinary room. It was like a time capsule. Everything that a man had accumulated over 60 years was still here. The books, the notes, the unfinished texts on the typewriter. No one wanted to immediately touch his belongings. It felt as though they were not items belonging to someone, but rather pieces of a story. The hotel management decided to donate his belongings. The books were sent to a library, his typewriter was given to a museum, and the old newspapers were archived. But one thing remained unchanged in the room: the memory of Davidson. After Davidson's death, hotel staff began telling stories about him. New employees were told there was a man who lived here for 60 years. Old guests said they could still feel his presence in the hotel. Some night shift workers claimed to hear the rustling of paper from room 304 when passing by the door. Over time, Davidson became a hotel legend. Why he never left, what he had been searching for, or why he maintained the same routine for years was never known. Though it was said that Davidson had never left for 60 years, some of the older staff members claimed he would secretly sneak up to the hotel's terrace at night. What he did there remained a mystery. Perhaps he was watching the sky, or maybe he was observing the changes in the city from a distance. But whatever it was, he would always return. Because for him, the only real world was the one inside room 304. After Davidson's death, the hotel management made a decision. Room 304 would never be given to anyone else. That room would be preserved in his memory. Years passed, the hotel was renovated multiple times, new guests arrived, and old staff members retired. But when people walked through the hotel's corridors and saw the door with the number still on it, they couldn't shake a strange feeling, because that room was the place where time had stopped. And inside once a man had silently lived for 60 years,